Hello everyone, Cartoon McDowell here, and today we're going to be learning about Russia! Though, I guess you already knew that if you'd read the text. Thus far, we haven't really talked too much about Russia in our class. We mentioned them as one of the many groups of people added at arrow point to the Mongol Empire, but that hardly made them unique. So today, we're going to take Russia from its humble beginnings up to the point where it became the largest nation on the planet. The earliest Russian state is known as the Kievan Rus, and it formed sometime during the 800s. Its inhabitants were a mixture of Slavic and Baltic people groups, though there's some strong debate over who was there first, and they were based in the city of Kiev, which is conveniently located on the Dnieper River, which, of course, means that they were big into trading. Their trade partners were the Scandinavian Vikings to the north, which probably added to the Vikings created Russia idea, and the not yet conquered Byzantine Empire to the south. And the Byzantine Empire's linkages to the Kievan Rus would turn out to be critically important to the development of Russian culture. Most notably, in 988, the Kievan prince Vladimir converted to Orthodox Christianity, the same flavor of Christianity practiced by the Byzantines, but not by Western Europe. As a side note, there's a fun story about Vladimir claiming that he shopped around for a new national religion, but rejected Judaism because of circumcision, and rejected Islam because of its ban on alcohol and, well, Russia. That story, by the way, doesn't show up until 125 years after Vladimir's conversion. In reality, Russian elites had been exposed to Christianity for quite some time, and Vladimir had actually agreed to convert to Christianity in 987 in exchange for the Byzantine Emperor's sister and recognition from the Emperor as his equal. Regardless, just like other places we've seen, once the elite converted, you know who followed? Everyone else. Anyway, the conversion of Vladimir brought with it a host of other Byzantine influences: architectural styles, the Cyrillic alphabet, and the use of icons of Christian figures during religious services. Orthodox Christianity also provided a cultural unity to the Rus, which, given their position and somewhat unclear ethnic origins, they hadn't had before. Cultural unity, by the way, does not mean political unity, and by the 1200s the Russian heartland had fractured into a group of small, feuding principalities. Truthfully, late in the Rus period, there wasn't a Russian state. And then the Mongols showed up. The Mongols conquered Russia by 1240, utilizing their usual combination of adapted technology, in this case from the Chinese and Muslim civilizations they had taken, lightning-fast horse archers, and the wholesale slaughter of people who resisted them. After the conquest, though, the Mongols ruled Russia with a fairly hands-off approach. Compared to Persia and China, Russia didn't seem to have a lot to offer the Mongols. There weren't any major trade routes, there weren't many desirable goods, and a lot of it was flat, open steppe country, which the Mongols had plenty of back home. So the Mongols stayed sort of at arm's length with Russia, an ever-present threat that only occasionally actually showed up to correct the Russians when they weren't acting the way the Mongols preferred. The princes who ran the various bits and pieces of Russia had to be approved by the Mongols, and the Mongols would pick a grand prince to serve as their representative and tax collector in Russia. In addition, one of the cities that had resisted Mongol rule, and which had been obliterated for causing trouble, was Kiev, the original center of the Rus. In its place, new cities rose to prominence, the most important of which was Muscovy, or as we call it today, Moscow. The Mongols tended to favor Muscovite princes becoming the Grand Prince, which not only increased Moscow's political power, but also its wealth. When the Russian part of the Mongol Empire went into decline in the late 1400s, it was a Muscovite prince who began the process of kicking the Mongols out of Russia, further enhancing Moscow's prestige amongst the Russian people. And, by the way, I've been using the term Russia. There wasn't really a Russia at this point, but, gotta keep things simple. Once the Mongols were gone more or less for good, which was basically around the same time Columbus was crossing the Atlantic to arrive in India, this new Moscow-centered Russia began its expansion and to emerge as a unified state. The first target of expansion were the pastoral nomads who lived to the south and east of civilized Russia, and who still represented a threat to the Russian state because of their habitual raiding. After those groups were subjugated, Russia turned its attention towards Siberia. Now, if you're wondering why anybody would want Siberia in the 15 and 1600s, the answer is the same as why anyone would want Canada in the 1500s. Fur. Native Siberians were small in number, disunified, and technologically inferior to the Russian state. and their story is going to be depressingly similar to that of the Native Americans we saw in the fur trade. The first ones to encounter European Russians were struck with disease. The survivors became dependent upon Russian goods. But native Siberians also got a bonus dose of misery. The only fur buyers they had were Russians, and the lack of competition between European powers meant the Russians could treat them however they wanted. Eventually, Russian authorities passed a tax on every able-bodied Siberian male between the ages of 18 and 50, and that tax was to be paid in furs. To ensure that they got this payment, hostages would be taken and threatened with death if fur quotas weren't met. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, the Grand Princes acquired more and more power until, in the late 1400s, Muscovite Grand Prince Ivan III began to refer to himself in letters as Tsar, the Russian word for Caesar, and that's yet another connection to the Byzantines. Ivan III's grandson, Ivan IV, was the first Russian ruler to be crowned as Tsar in 1547, and he's also probably the first person in this video you've actually heard of, because he's the Tsar better known as Ivan the Terrible. The terrible in his name, by the way, actually translates better to impressive or formidable, but his reign was pretty awful for the people he distrusted, which was most of them. Ivan's actually the leader who kicks off the streak of authoritarian leadership in Russia that continued up until, actually I'll have to get back to you on an end date for that. But with that said, we tend to focus more on trends and forces here in AP World than on the classic big man history, and the expansion of the Russian Empire absolutely impacted the people it absorbed. Steppe people and Siberians tended to become Russified. They began to speak Russian and converted to Orthodox Christianity. To the west, Russia had to contend with a number of established empires, notably the Swedes, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Ottoman Empire. Through contact with these empires and tours of Western Europe by various Russian officials, the Russian Tsars also became aware of how backward their country had become compared to Western European nations and the Ottomans. And attempts were made to fix this, most notably by Tsar Peter the Great's attempt at westernizing Russia by fixing its administration, education, and military systems. He famously ordered Russian nobles to ditch their traditional garments and shave their beards, and he even constructed a new capital on land taken from the Swedes, St. Petersburg. This isn't the only time we'll see a group look at Western Europe and think, we have to catch up to them. But Russia existed in sort of an odd zone. It held huge Asian territories, it bordered China, it considered itself a bulwark of Christendom against Muslim Ottomans, but it didn't practice Catholicism or Protestantism like Western Europe did. So even though they sought to mirror Western Europe, Russia developed its own unique identity, and it was frequently seen as an other, not European enough for Europeans, and not Asian enough for Asians. And that's a trend that we're going to see continue into our next couple of units as well. And that's all for today. Hope you learned something. Bye.